at the University of Sheffield, and he had been interested in chirality of the, and the structural properties of supramolecular nanotubes. I remember what chirality is from the basic courses in chemistry, and I thought it was quite hard not to understand, but to represent, because you are working with only two dimensions. Yeah, and now I won't disturb you anymore. Please come on with you, speak about transitions in the university lab, teaching in the age of pandemic. Please, Thomas.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, so that's the title of my talk. I'm from the University of Sheffield, and to give a bit more background on me, and there is a reason why I'm talking so much about myself, I'll explain in a moment. So this is my educational background. I was part of only the second year group to take A-levels, which for those who don't know is the university qualification in England, with AQA, that's an exam board, following the introduction of AS levels. So that was a reform to the A levels, which meant that all the teachers had no real idea what they were going on, and they were scrambling to, you know, adapt to the new system. So my point is, I know what that's like to be a student in that situation. I then did an MA in Natural Sciences at the University of Cambridge, followed by a PhD under Jeremy Sanders at the same place. And since 2012, I've been employed by the University of Sheffield as a university teacher. So that's a bit of background on me. Whoops, going forward a bit. Accident there. So as I say, there were two key transitions in my career, one going from A level to university, from school to university, and one going from university to employment. And I think these are the two key transitions for anyone. For some people, employment may take the form of further study, for others it may take the form of something else altogether. So in my education research work, I've focused on the first of these transitions, A level to university, and that's what I'm going to be talking about here, among other things. So a couple of years ago, I took over our first year undergraduate lab course, and this was at quite short notice when a colleague retired. And the advice I was given at the time was just keep it running the way it is before. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. And it was known that we were changing the curriculum anyway the year after. So it was thought, what's the point in changing this? But I had some reasons for why I wanted to try more incrementally changing things. And this was because I was aware the AQA logo has changed since I did my A-levels, but they're still doing the same things. And according to basically two directives from the Her Majesty's government, the AQA and other exam boards had changed the A-levels in order to, well, make some differences to the science A-levels in particular. And there's a full document from them here I've linked to at the bottom if you're interested in the full details. But if you're not, here's a brief summary. So the point is that now there must be a minimum of 12 assessed practical experiments in a chemistry a chemistry A-level course. Students must pass 5 competencies in particular areas of chemistry, practical chemistry, in order to receive a practical endorsement, which is completely separate to how well have they done in their A-level exams. And the experiments that schools choose will invariably include recrystallization and titration, for example, because those are just easy to do and they're commonplace out the box ones. The idea behind this reform was basically to try and close an inequality gap between poorer and wealthier schools, to ensure that students from poorer backgrounds in more disadvantaged areas did not not do any practical chemistry. You know, in the past it might have been they just saw something demonstrated by their teacher, which obviously meant they were not as well prepared as their colleagues from wealthier areas going to wealthier schools when they got to university. So although inequality still exists because the 12 is just a minimum, it does mean that it has helped close that gap, as we'll see. So you know, it is quite fashionable, obviously, in education to bash any government initiative, and one can understand why, considering they often cause such disruption, as I described in my own studies. So I understand what our own students have been through, but I do think this one certainly had its heart in the right place. So what I decided to do was I didn't make any huge changes to our course initially on the first year. So I was getting the first group of students who had gone through this new A-level. But I did decide, I made a few changes that were sort of no-brainer changes, such as bringing in lab notebooks, because they now do that at A-level, so it would be silly not to. But primarily what I did was I decided to consult these new students on their responses to how the course currently was and record their reactions to some ideas I'd come up with for next year based on my understanding of how things had changed. I also consulted our graduate teaching assistants and postgraduate lab teachers on what their impressions were of the new students. And in order to help me with this, I used something called the Student Observation of Teaching Programme, or SUT programme, which is an excellent programme in the University of Sheffield organised by Tim Herrick. And what that involved was an older student from a different department could anonymously talk to the student. So the students weren't telling me, no, I think your idea is stupid, which they obviously wouldn't do because of the power dynamic thing. So, you know, they're not going to say that to the person who's marking their work. So it going via a third party meant I got a more honest response from the students. So the key findings of these early informal searchers were the GTAs and the lab teachers consistently felt this group of students, they didn't know more about chemistry, they didn't know more about the theory of chemistry, but they had grown more confident in practical work. And that makes a huge difference at first year level, because the biggest problem historically we've had is sort of students who've have this idea, you know, safety tends to be emphasized to weed out the sort of one student out of 30 who thinks it's a good idea to eat some magnesium. That did happen at my school. And the reality is that this just causes the majority of fairly cautious students to panic when they're in a chemistry lab. Everything is dangerous, I will freeze up. And then the hard part is getting them just to come out of their shell and engage with the practical chemistry. So the fact that the extra practical experience early meant that they weren't as were on being confronted with a university chemistry lab made a huge difference, and that meant we could challenge them more. We could expect more of them. We could assume their cognitive load, to use the excellent phrase used in the previous talk, was not taken up so enormously by just the fact I'm in a chemistry lab and this is consuming all my attention. The students were also enthusiastic about having more concise lab manuals when I put that question to them, and I'll explain why later. The key principle I took for reforming our lab course was first focus on resolving any outstanding problems before innovating. Though you can combine the two, come up with a new experiment to replace a not fit for purpose one, for instance. And to gain, this is the most important point I want to make in this talk, to gain student engagement and respect with changes, or the course as it stands, students must have confidence in your knowledge of their previous experience. That's very important. If you unknowingly reinvent the wheel, that's not just wasting your time and their time, it's fatal for losing their engagement. So I thought back to my own experience as a student. So when I was doing my A-levels, which, as I said, had just been changed at the time, one of the things we did at A-level was we studied nuclear magnetic resonance, NMR spectroscopy, which is a big, important innovation in chemistry. For those who don't know, it changed the world. It's the same thing as MRI, but for studying molecules. And it means we no longer mess around with test tubes and Bunsen burners saying, does this turn blue? You know, therefore it's this type of functional group. We use spectroscopy. And this was really important. But I found that when I went to university, the courses there acted as though we had no previous knowledge of NMR. Now, maybe they were just trying to be inclusive of students from different backgrounds who might not have done it. But my reaction as a student was, if they don't know what I already know, then how is it worth me investing my time in this? And it leads to complacency. So that's just my notes from when I was an undergraduate, which I've kept there as an illustration. So that's one example of my own experience. So therefore, my point here is, if students have an existing skill, firstly, acknowledge that they have it. Secondly, give them the opportunity to practice it. Don't do something once and then never touch it again for 2 years, by which time they've forgotten. And if you do choose to repeat an exercise they have already done, such as a recrystallization, if you ask any students, in a UK chemistry lab now, have you done a recrystallization? They'll pretty much all put their hands up because they've all done it at A level. So if you choose to repeat that, we still do that as an introductory experiment. Explain why. We're doing this because it's about practice, or we're taking this to a higher theoretical level than you've previously experienced. There has to be a reason for it. So I decided to conduct some anonymous surveys in semester 1 of that year. So that's just in the background. That is a sample which I've cut down of the Likert scale questionnaires I had. And unfortunately, I plan to follow these up in semester 2 to discuss the results, but that academic year was 2019 to 2020, so that wasn't great. So I had to cancel the focus groups, because at that point we're still working out how to put things online. Now, fortunately, almost all lab classes had already been completed, with only a few. I had to come up with a few small online activities right at the end, as I imagine a lot of us did. But this did mean I couldn't do the planned focus groups. So therefore, I've repeated the same survey this year with a new group of students because we have continued teaching practical classes throughout 2020, as I'll explain how we did that later. And in a few weeks' time, in fact, I will be contacting them about these focus groups. So therefore, please understand all the data I'm presenting here is from last year, so it has not been discussed in focus groups yet. That's just the limitation. So here's another example of a disconnect between understanding of teachers and their students. So a fairly famous quote within pedagogy is from Mark Prensky in 2001 there. The most useful designation I found for students is digital natives. Our students today are all native speakers of the digital language of computers, video games and the internet. That's the theory, below is the practice. So a student who was born a year after Mark Prensky said that asked me in the lab, I could use more help with this assignment. I've never really used a computer before. Now, that's probably an edge case, to be fair, but it's important to understand that our stereotypes of students as, you know, born with the ability to code, it does not reflect the reality. The fact that somebody has grown up with a smartphone in their pocket does not mean they know how to use Microsoft Excel, for example. And often I've found talking to students that they feel a bit lost because every level of teachers have just assumed they know this stuff, and so they've never been taught it. And obviously this became very relevant in 2020, at which time you know, we were suddenly doing a lot of distance learning teaching. So it's very important to avoid these stereotypes. One of the things I asked the students was, do you agree with this description of yourself as digital natives? 70% said yes, which is a lot, but it does mean 30% don't agree with that. So, and also, what do they understand by that meaning? So this is something I want to discuss in focus groups. Here's a more specific example here. So again, I anecdotally noted a lot of students, when faced with Excel or any spreadsheet software, will do sums by hand and then write them into the spreadsheet, which makes me bang my head against a wall. The point is they have not been introduced to the concept of what spreadsheets are for. And so I asked them this question, and, you know, almost as controls, I asked them about Word and PowerPoint or their equivalents. And what the Excel results match what I expected from anecdotally. Over half the students say they were not confident using Excel before they arrived at university. That's something we have to bear in mind. That is something they need to learn. Something that was almost as surprising, actually. Obviously, Word was very high. Most students know how to use that to a certain degree, at least. What surprised me was they told me that they had more experience than I expected using PowerPoint and doing presentations. We tend to assume that students are not familiar with doing presentations, and so we teach them as though it's the first time they've done them. In fact, they told me that has been emphasized at A-level. So although they will still make mistakes, they're not the same mistakes that maybe I made as someone who hadn't done as many presentations when I was in university. So that's significant for how physical chemistry labs and presentation skills are developed. Here's something that I've personally found a bit troubling. We heard about it in the talk yesterday from Ireland. Are students still scholars? Are they still readers? One of the things I asked the students was, do you still read books for pleasure? And that might seem like a non sequitur, but my point is that if someone is not used to consuming a large piece of written work in a sitting, then presenting them with a textbook, a large textbook, will not simply be, that looks like a big textbook, but nobody could possibly expect me to read any of that. Therefore, it must just be for symbolic reasons. And we often get that view from students. Not that they won't read much of the textbook, that they will never read any of it. So that is a serious problem. And it reflects, again, we heard in the last talk about potentially using different media like videos or interactive multimedia. So that is an example. And as a control, I also asked them about video streaming, which is, of course, remains a more common form of entertainment. So with that in mind, what's the best way to design lab manuals? So the ones I inherited from my predecessor were over 270 pages per semester, which was enormous. The reason for this was my predecessor, his logic was every time a student asked a question, he added the answer back into the book and then put it under every experiment. I can see the logic to it, but if you keep making the book longer and longer, then the student will never open it in the first place, and therefore it's pointless. Thank you. Yeah, so safety and skills were repeated redundantly year on year because we assumed the student couldn't carry around another of these books every time. So it was wasteful and, you know, not good for the rainforest for us. Start. So I wrote up 2 new manuals, which are both a lot shorter. A 9-page experiment becomes a 5-page one in the new one. So one of the manuals covers just the experimental protocols for one semester, and the other one, the safety and techniques manual, that has everything the student needs to carry on through each semester each year, all the safety information and the basic techniques described generically, so they can always go back and look at those without having all the fluff intended for someone who is doing an experiment for the first time. And the student feedback from this was, again, 70% of them thought this, or 75% thought this was a good idea. It does mean a minority don't. So again, I want to have a dialogue with those students through focus groups to see what their understanding of this is and whether they have alternative ideas in mind. But on the whole, this seems to have been a change that was well received. And this is the most important bit of information here. Again, about 70% of the students feel I or we who deliver the lab course understand what they already know from A-level, and the course is designed with that in mind. Again, a minority don't, so we need to speak to those people and find out what their views are. I will briefly talk about pandemic response before we finish. So it was very hard for me to find a good picture of our teaching labs. So this is just a picture of staff here from years ago. And the teaching labs we have, some of them are these old-fashioned looking ones with wooden surfaces, which we were always embarrassed to put in the recruitment literature. We thought it would put students off. And our estates at the University of Sheffield were always telling us off, saying these are big, these are wasteful, they cost a lot in terms of land rent. Suddenly, when the pandemic happened, having a big, large, spacious teaching lab with over 2 meters in between each fume cupboard was suddenly a very valuable thing. And as a result of that, we've been able to teach 18 students safely in a lab that would normally take 55. And by teaching labs 4 days a week, according to the schedule shown here, that allowed us to get through. All of our students have had an almost complete, they've had almost the same number of experiments that they would in a normal year, taught practically in the lab. And I'm very pleased and proud of that achievement, not just from me, but from our technical staff and our postgrads in organising this. And notice how students who previously had to do experiments in pairs now had to work individually. So me redesigning all those lab materials to focus on the independent learning they developed from the new A-level practicals, suddenly that made sense, and we could expect these students to be able to do these experiments individually and not in pairs, as had previously been the case in former years. So in conclusion, we must respond to changes in A-levels or whatever your pre-university qualification is in your country. But the problem it faces is also an opportunity to challenge our students. When I innovated to take advantage of this by challenging the students more, not having giant manuals which answer every conceivable question, but asking the students to assume things like, I can work out for myself it's a 100ml beaker I need, it doesn't have to say use a 100ml beaker, then that stood us in good stead for the more distance independent pandemic teaching. And finally, don't reduce the student experience to stereotypes. It's important to stay in close consultation with the students so they understand what you are trying to achieve with innovations. Okay, thank you for listening, and I'll open the floor to questions.
Thank you very much. Is there anyone who would like to put some questions on this? I can have one myself. When I was reading your text, I thought about the figures, and then I remember the situation when we were trying to write something about what we have done during the year at the teacher education program. Some of the teachers didn't like to have any tables or diagrams or anything in the text because they didn't know how to do it, and they were never used to use this type of representations at all. And it's quite strange for me, as a scientist of this, that anyone in the university could say, I can't read a table, I can't read, but they can read.
That is a very interesting insight. It's not something I'd considered, but yes, I would not be surprised, as you say, that's not just a thing with students, but potentially with staff as well in other disciplines. That's a good point. I think we've got a couple of questions now, haven't we?
Please answer the questions you can see on the board.
Yeah, I can see that. So from JJazz2Co, sorry, I don't know your real name. What are some ways you get feedback from students? I will briefly, I don't want to spend a lot of time, but briefly, if you can use paper forms in the lab at the start of a session, do so, because that is a far better way of getting responses than anything online. The only way to get good responses from online forms is if they're physically in a room doing computer work. The point is that there is a peer pressure element of, if everyone is doing this, obviously you make it with consent and so on, but if they see other people doing this, they will do the same. If you do it as one email in a mass of other emails, they will ignore it. And so, I've seen papers published and policy decisions made on sort of 3 responses out of 300 or something ridiculous. So I'm very pleased to say the feedback I got here was about 97% of the class, and that's a rather more useful piece of information. Okay, so Geetka asked a couple of questions. Does the shorter manual help students who don't have any prior knowledge to extend their learning? I would say so. It's more about making sure they get the fundamentals, and it's not there aren't too many asides, because as I say, the manual they inherited had lots of asides, which again I can see the logic of them, but for someone who sort of doesn't have the attention span from reading regularly to take that into account, it can just become sort of blurry and incoherent to students. So that was my logic there. Geetika's other question: how do you manage to teach technology in labs at the same time? Well, primarily this is because in physical chemistry experiments we would typically spend the morning collecting data and then the afternoon doing data analysis on computers in the lab. So that's how that works, more or less. And they will get guidance from the same postgraduate lab teachers for both parts. Yeah, and okay, and Marika asks, have you tried making movies to explain an experiment? Yeah, this is something, it's an exchange I've had with the students. So the students actually spontaneously asked me, what about lab videos? My only concern with that at the moment is because of the nature of how our labs work, it's unlikely they'd be able to refer to that in situ in the lab, which I think is what they would probably want to do rather than beforehand. However, we do have a deal in the university with a company called Learning Science, which does these interactive animations of experimental techniques. So we've made those available to students in lieu of that. And I think that's all the questions. I don't want to take up too much time because the next person will be waiting.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think it's time to go